The air over Pine Hollow hung thick with the scent of smoke and wet earth, as if the forest itself had exhaled a warning. Dawn had not yet claimed the sky, and the churchyard lay under a pall of mist that clung to the tombstones like a living shroud. Each marker, blackened with age and lichen, seemed to breathe under the weight of the morning fog. They whispered that the churchyard earth never cooled, for her smile lingered where the coffins sank. The preacher's daughter, a girl of no more than 12, moved between the graves with a silence that betrayed no childlike hesitation. Her dress, once white, now bore the sallow stains of autumn leaves and soot from the hearth. Her eyes, wide and bright, gleamed in the half-light with a knowingness beyond her years. She paused at the newest mound, a fresh slab of earth that rose like a pulse above the soil. The smell of damp clay clung to her fingertips, yet her lips curled in that familiar, haunting smile. Beneath the church's rotting beams, faint laughter echoed, a child's laughter that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. It slipped through the cracks of the hymnals stacked in the pulpit, weaving itself between the stanzas like a secret note. Those who had ventured near the church after sundown claimed they could hear it clearly, as if the dead themselves had learned to sing again. "Do you hear them?" a voice whispered behind a veil of wind. It was old Miriam, the gravedigger's widow, wrapped in layers of threadbare shawls. She cowered beside a toppled gravestone, fingers tight around a lantern that trembled in her grasp. The girl's head tilted slowly, hair falling like a black veil over one shoulder. "Hear what?" she asked softly, voice like the scraping of dry leaves. "The ones beneath," Miriam breathed, pointing toward the freshly turned earth. "They stir when you smile." A small laugh slid from the girl's throat. It was not cruel nor entirely innocent. It was the kind of sound that made the skin crawl, a bell tolling for something long forgotten. Her gaze fixed on the coffin beneath the mound. She knelt, brushing her hands across the soil with a care that bordered on reverence. "They listen," she said, "and they answer." The trees shivered, their bare branches rattling like chains. From somewhere beyond the churchyard, a crow cawed, its voice split by an unnatural echo that seemed to carry from the past itself. The mist thickened, swallowing the path back to the village. No one had dared come this far after sundown for years, but the preacher's daughter had never known fear. She felt the earth beneath her fingers, soft and yielding, and imagined the hands of those beneath reaching up, seeking to brush her cheek, as if drawn by the warmth of her smile. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of charred wood. Pine Hollow had burned many times before, and the scars of fire still laced the forest floor. Ashes from the old church bell tower toppled decades ago, mixed with the loam around the graves, creating a grey dust that clung to the girl's hair and dress. She breathed it in, tasting iron and decay, and her smile widened. Some said the ashes whispered secrets when the moon was low, naming the dead, the soon-to-die, and those who would watch and never leave. From inside the church, a door creaked. The preacher stirred from his slumber in the vestry above, drawn by the faint sound of footsteps and the echoing laughter. He had learned to distrust her smile, though he did not know why. It was not malice he feared, nor mischief. It was the knowledge that she bore witness to things the living were never meant to see. Yet, as always, when he rushed toward the yard, the mist seemed to twist, folding him into shadow, until the girl's figure alone remained, unmoved, waiting. A sudden rustling drew her attention to the far side of the graveyard. Fallen leaves swirled as if caught in an unseen vortex, forming the shape of a small boy, pale and translucent, staring with empty eyes. Are you real?" she asked softly, tilting her head. The boy's lips moved, but no sound came. Only the shifting ash and soil responded, a murmuring chorus beneath the earth. Her laughter returned, softer this time, a note of awe threaded with an unsettling familiarity. She rose, brushing the soil from her hands, and whispered, "They have many names, and now as they will know mine." The wind carried the words across the graveyard, curling around the tombstones, seeping into the roots of the trees, and slipping down into the soil where the dead rested. Somewhere, deep below, a stirring answered her voice, slow and deliberate, like the turning of a coffin lid. The sky began to pale, not with sunlight, but with the grey hue of something older, a dawn not of this world. The girl turned to leave the mound, but one finger lingered, tracing a circle in the ash. A faint glow emanated where her hand had passed, a light that was not fire nor moon nor sun. It pulsed, and the earth quivered with a heartbeat not its own. Behind her a shadow detached itself from the mist. It was small, boyish and pale, yet taller than any child should be. Its head tilted unnaturally, and its eyes held the shimmer of graves long sealed. The girl's smile faltered for the first time, but only for a breath. "They're awake," she whispered. The bell tolled 3 times before the first shadow moved, a sound heavy and hollow, like the knuckles of death rapping at the church doors. Outside, fog coiled through the graveyard in slow, curling fingers, swallowing the path to the village, and leaving only the procession of mourners, stooped, shivering and silent, marching toward the bier. Her lips curved as the bell tolled, soft and deliberate, a smile that seemed to know secrets none of the living should glimpse. It was not joy, yet it was something worse, the promise of seeing more than any mortal should bear. The coffin rested upon the cold, damp earth, its polished surface catching the weak light of the lanterns carried by trembling hands. Flowers, once bright, drooped like exhausted ghosts, petals darkened and curling at the edges. The mourners shivered in unison, their grief palpable, yet their eyes kept flicking toward her, the preacher's daughter, whose small figure moved beside the bier as if drawn by invisible strings. She smiles at it," muttered one, villager clutching his coat close to his chest. "At death itself." "She sees it differently," whispered another, voice shaking. "She knows its language." The girl's fingers brushed the velvet covering of the coffin. She did not lift it, nor did she cry, nor speak aloud. She only smiled. The mourners turned away, afraid that her joy, or what they thought joy, would bind their grief forever. Yet their horror did not keep them from witnessing the subtle way the flowers trembled, petals quivering like the wings of trapped moths. From inside the church the preacher's voice rose, strained and brittle, attempting a hymn to comfort the living. But his words faltered, swallowed by the mist, and in their place came a faint chorus beneath the planks of the floorboards, the soft, stifled breathing of the departed. The girl tilted her head, listening, lips parting ever so slightly, and the sound of the dead seemed to pulse in response to her smile. "She hears them," an old man whispered, leaning on his cane, "and they answer." The wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of wet pine and something fouler, an undertone of decay that made the villagers gag. The girl's small form became the epicenter of a subtle tremor in the air. Lantern flames flickered toward her as though drawn by an unseen magnet. A child's laughter echoed again, faint, lilting, but now layered with something heavier, something like the size of the coffins themselves. The priest stepped forward, trying to place a hand over hers, but hesitated. His fingers hovered, trembling, as if the air around her could burn. "Stay away, child," he said, voice quivering. Do not invite them here." Her smile did not falter. Instead, she whispered, soft and deliberate, "They are already here." At her words, the coffin shivered. The villagers gasped, clutching one another, eyes wide in terror. The air grew heavier, thick with an unnameable pressure, as if the dead beneath the soil were pressing upward, eager to be acknowledged. From the earth came a low groan, almost imperceptible, like wood bending under strain, and the girl's head tilted, listening. Her eyes gleamed in the lantern light, reflecting shadows that should not exist, shapes too long and thin to belong to any living thing. The casket lid trembled, dust falling from its edges like dry skin. The flowers quivered more violently. One by one, petals lifted and fell, twisting in the air before landing upon the girl's dress as though paying homage. She did not flinch. She did not speak. She only smiled, and in that smile a terrible calm reigned, a calm that suggested she could command the very dead to rise if she wished. The villagers dared not approach. Mothers clutched children, and fathers hid faces in the folds of coats and scarves, but all felt it, the undeniable pull, the binding gravity of her presence. Somewhere deep in the mist, a crow's call broke the silence, echoing unnaturally long. Each note stretched as if it had been buried, and now clawing its way back into the world of the living. "She names them," Miriam whispered from the edge of the graveyard, voice shaking like a dying flame. With her smile she names them, and the named Obey. The girl's lips parted slightly, humming a note that seemed both familiar and impossible. The sound wound itself into the soil beneath, the coffin threading through the earth like an unseen root. A tremor ran up the legs of the mourners. Knees buckled as though the ground itself sought to pull them down into the dark. The bell tolled again, unbidden, though the rope had not moved, and the girl's smile deepened, small and perfect, cruel and innocent at once. Then, in the final moment before the coffin was lowered into the grave, the earth split slightly at one corner. A faint hand, pale and slick with dirt, emerged, curling over the edge. The crowd froze, heartbeats caught in throats as the girl's gaze fell upon it, not with fear, not with surprise, but with recognition. "They are awake," she whispered again, almost reverently. And the hand trembled, twitching toward her, as if seeking the warmth of the smile that could summon them. The mourners turned, horrified, but the mist swallowed the scene, leaving only her small figure standing above the disturbed earth, a single lantern flickering at her feet. Behind her, the shadow of the church stretched long and crooked, and in that shadow shapes shifted that were not human. A new name hovered on her lips, and as she opened her mouth to speak it, the fog swallowed her entirely, leaving nothing but the faint echo of laughter and the twitching hand disappearing slowly into the soil once more. The bier waited, silent, yet somehow alive, as though the dead had claimed it in her absence. The church breathed with a weight that was older than time, a musty living thing that pressed against the ribs of anyone who entered. Dust hung thick in the air, motes drifting in shafts of sickly light that leaked through the cracked, stained glass. A hymn no one remembered appeared on the pulpit, scrawled in trembling ink, letters jagged and uneven, yet precise in a way that suggested purpose rather than accident. It was a song older than memory, older than the first pine felled for the rafters above, and yet it throbbed with familiarity in the bones of the living. The preacher's daughter knelt before it, small hands brushing over the notes as though they were carved in flesh rather than paper. Her lips parted, and she hummed the tune with uncanny ease, a sound at once fragile and unyielding. Each note slithered through the air, curling around the pews, threading through the floorboards, tugging at the marrow of those who listened. The congregation, few brave and trembling, froze in place, eyes wide, hearts hammering. Do you know it?" whispered old Miriam from the back, the shawl over her head trembling as though it had its own pulse. The girl's head tilted, hair falling like a shadow across her cheek. "It remembers me," she said softly. Her voice was a thread so delicate it might have been mistaken for the sighing of the wind. "And I remember it." The sound of the hymn grew stronger, filling the wooden hall, vibrating through the beams. Above, rattling dust from the rafters. The notes carried with them a cold weight, pressing into the skin, making the villagers' teeth chatter and bones ache. Something began to move in the shadows, a slow, deliberate motion behind the pulpit, behind the benches, where the candlelight could not reach. A pew groaned as though bending under invisible hands. The girl's eyes followed it without turning, noting the movement like a gardener observing the growth of a vine. "They come when it is sung," she whispered. The words were not warning. They were announcement. From the dark corners of the church, a faint scratching began, as if fingernails traced the walls from beneath. The candle flames shivered violently, elongating the girl's shadow until it stretched past the altar, curling along the walls and pooling at the edges of the ceiling. The air thickened, a fog rolling in from the damp floorboards, carrying the smell of wet pine and something fouler, rot beneath soil and stone. Do not call them so," the preacher stammered, voice cracking. He pressed one hand against the pulpit as though it were a shield, yet the hymn's vibrations seeped into his flesh, tugging at his spine, pulling at memories he could not name. Each note felt like a finger, curling inside him, tracing the shape of fear he had never known. The girl continued humming, the tune growing richer, darker, yet impossibly childlike. It twisted through the wooden beams, sinking into the floor like ink spilled into water. One by one the shadows began to tremble, rising slightly as if lifted by invisible hands. The faint outline of a child, or perhaps several, materialized. In the gloom, pale and twitching, with eyes too bright and wide for this world. "They answer me," she said, almost in awe, and the shadows bowed slightly, moving in time with the unseen rhythm. "They remember the hymn. They remember what it asks." A low, guttural moan rose from beneath the church, vibrating through the floor. The villagers gasped, clutching one another as though the hymn might tear them apart. Dust fell in sheets from the rafters, and the smell of smoke and decay thickened until it stung the lungs. Candle flames guttered. A sudden wind, cold and unnatural, swept through the hall, extinguishing all but the one at the pulpit where the girl stood. Old Miriam staggered forward, voice hoarse. Child, stop! You do not know what you summon." The girl's head turned slowly, deliberately, hair veiling half her face. "I do," she said. "I have always known." Her lips curled in that same slow smile that had haunted the churchyard for years. The shadows shivered, stretching toward her, fingers of darkness seeking the warmth of her small body. A hand appeared from the floor near the altar, pale, trembling, as though the earth itself had chosen to offer it. The girl knelt and touched, it humming, and the hand stilled in a curious obedience. A second hand followed, then a third. The hymn pulsed through the room, pulling the spectral forms upward, shaping them, naming them. The villagers could do nothing but watch, frozen in a terror that sank deep into the marrow. Each note from the girl was a command, each hum a binding spell. The shadows gathered near her, forming figures of those long buried, children, men, women, faces pale, eyes hollow yet keen, bodies thin as parchment. They moved in perfect cadence, with the hymn floating just above the floorboards, silent and obedient. "Why do you do this?" the preacher whispered, tears streaking his face. "Why do you call them?" "They are mine," the girl replied, voice soft yet unyielding. "And I will have their listening." She rose taller somehow, the candlelight bending around her like molten silver. The shadows of the dead rose with her, swirling in a circle, forming a ring of pale eyes and trembling fingers that followed her every movement. Then, from the pulpit, the black hymnal shuddered, the ink bubbling as though alive. The letters twisted and writhed, forming names none dared speak. A sudden crack split the air. The church groaned, the beams bowed, and the ceiling whispered with voices older than memory. The girl's smile deepened as she reached out, humming louder, and the shadows swirled higher, faces peering from the darkness, eyes glowing faintly with the light of graves. The villagers could not scream. They could not move. They were bound by the resonance of the tune, by the slow, deliberate power of the child and her black hymn. Outside, the mist began to seep into the church, curling around the pews and snaking toward the altar, carrying whispers of names long forgotten, of sins long buried, of promises unfulfilled. And then, as the last note trembled on her lips, the black hymnal rose from the pulpit, pages fluttering violently, as though caught in a storm no wind could have summoned. The shadows paused mid-air, faces frozen in silent anticipation. The girl's eyes widened, gleaming with unnatural light, and her lips parted in a whisper that carried both awe and command. "They are listening, and they are coming." The candle flickered one last time, then went out, leaving the church. In suffocating darkness, alive with waiting shapes and the faint, terrible echo of a hymn older than death itself, the church smelled of old wood, damp stone, and something fouler, like iron left to rot beneath a tombstone. From the pulpit, the preacher's voice cracked, each word brittle as dry twigs underfoot. "She is a blessing," he said, sweat darkening, the fabric at his collar, yet the syllables fell like stones into a hollow well. The congregation, seated in rigid pews, felt the rafters groan above them. A low, deliberate creak that was more than timber settling. It was as if the church itself mourned his words. Outside, the wind clutched at the spire, carrying whispers from the trees that lined the cemetery. Branches scraped one another like fingernails over wood. Inside, every eye remained fixed on the girl. The preacher's daughter sat still on the floorboards, knees drawn to her chest, small hands clutching the folds of her skirt. Her lips curved faintly, a smile that seemed both innocent and precise, as if she already knew the doom threaded through the sermon. "Blessing," muttered old Miriam from the back, voice sharp with fear. "She is no blessing. She speaks to the dead." The preacher's head snapped toward her, eyes wide, voice trembling. "Silence, woman, God has given her light." His words faltered mid-air, swallowed by a low hum that emanated from the floorboards beneath the pews. The congregation stiffened, bodies frozen as the vibration threaded through bone and marrow alike. The girl's gaze lifted slowly, eyes darkening, pupils widening as if tasting the fear that clung to each heart. "She hears them," whispered a young mother clutching her child. "And they answer." The preacher swallowed, lips moving silently over a prayer that might have been protection or denial. "Do not speak so," he said, voice shaking, hands trembling as they gripped the pulpit. "She is God's light." "And yet—" His throat constricted. The "and yet" hung in the air like smoke from a candle snuffed too soon. Outside, the sky bruised, heavy clouds pressing low, carrying the promise of storm. The church windows rattled as if the heavens themselves were uncertain of what had been declared within. The girl shifted slightly, humming a low note that no one had heard before. It was not a song of innocence. It tugged at the air, bending it, making shadows stretch long and thin across the pews. The preacher's words faltered again, voice cracking, as if the very syllables feared to leave his mouth. "They groan," Miriam whispered. "The rafters, the boards, they groan when you speak her blessing." A strange draught swept the hall, carrying the smell of wet pine, decay, and something sharper, something metallic like blood cooled beneath stone. Candles flickered violently, throwing grotesque shapes across the walls. Shadows elongated and bent unnaturally, pooling toward the girl in silent reverence. She shifted her position, fingers brushing the floorboards, and the hum grew stronger, resonating through the wood like a song remembered only by the dead. The preacher stumbled down the steps, desperate to claim authority, to shield his flock. "Listen to me," he cried. "She is God's gift. You must not fear." A sudden crack split the air. A section of the pulpit floorboard lifted, as if pushed from beneath, and a pale hand emerged, fingers long and thin, curling toward the preacher's daughter. The congregation screamed, but the sound fell upon deaf ears. The girl's smile widened, lips parting slightly to release a soft, melodic laugh. The hand twitched and retreated into the darkness beneath the floor, only to be replaced by another, then another, fingers clawing, grasping at the air, seeking her. "They are listening," the girl whispered, voice precise, deliberate. "They remember the promises." The preacher's face turned ashen. "No, no." His knees buckled. The congregation murmured prayers under their breath, but the words had no weight here. The church walls shivered, and the rafters above groaned louder, as though the spirits of the dead had been roused by her small, deliberate presence. From the far corner, a shadow detached itself from the darkness. A boy, translucent and pale, crouched low, eyes glowing faintly with something older than life. The girl glanced toward him, nodding imperceptibly, and he rose, moving toward the pulpit with the grace of one summoned from sleep. The preacher staggered backward, tripping over a loose floorboard, and fell against a pew, eyes wide with terror. "She comes," he croaked, voice barely audible. "She brings them with her." The girl's humming intensified, the melody, threading through the air, through the wood, through every hidden corner of the church. The shadow boy followed her, others stirring from the darkness, shapes barely visible, moving with patience and precision. The congregation's fear became palpable, a tangible fog that clung to skin and hair. Even as they prayed, even as they begged for mercy, the dead responded only to her. Miriam stepped forward, trembling, voice sharp and broken. "Child, heed me. This is not blessing. This is summoning." The girl looked up, eyes wide but serene, as if seeing beyond the walls of the church, beyond the congregation, beyond the world itself. "It is not I who summons," she said softly, voice lilting and dreadful. "They call themselves. I only answer." The wind howled through the cracks in the walls. Lanterns shook and guttered. Outside, the first streaks of lightning illuminated the trees, revealing shadows that moved independently of the wind. Dark shapes with limbs bent at impossible angles, pressing toward the church as if drawn by the girl's song. The preacher tried to rise to flee, but the floorboards beneath his feet trembled, lifting slightly, and the shadowed hands beneath the pulpit reached higher, grasping, curling, claiming. He cried out, voice breaking, and the sound mingled with the humming of the girl and the groaning of the rafters, creating a cacophony that made the congregation's blood run cold. The girl's smile deepened. "They know your fear," she whispered. "They taste it. They remember it." A final crack split the air, as a section of the pulpit's floor rose entirely, revealing more pale hands reaching up, clawing at the girl, yet she did not flinch. Instead, she extended a hand toward the trembling preacher, and the shadows paused, suspended in an obedient, terrible stillness, and in that frozen, suffocating silence, one name whispered through the church, carried by the wind, echoed by the rafters, remembered by the floorboards, and sealed in the gaze of the girl. "Yours." The preacher's eyes widened in horror. Outside, the lightning struck the spire, and the shadowed figures in the forest tilted toward the church, as if acknowledging the signal. The girl's smile lingered perfect, unbroken, and the pulpit's floorboards quivered again. Beneath them, the earth itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting. The lanterns swayed in the bitter night wind, casting trembling pools of light across the sodden ground, revealing only fragments of the mourners' faces. The air was thick with the coppery tang of wet earth, mingled with smoke from candles burning low at the edges of graves. A coffin rested on trestles, its polished wood slick with dew, and the congregation stood stiffly, eyes downcast, hands clutching coats and prayer books, as though they could shield themselves from what was to come. Her gaze fell upon a pale face. Among the mourners, a man who had dared to look at her too long, whose eyes flickered with curiosity and fear in equal measure. The child's lips curved slowly, deliberately, and the shadows around her seemed to lean closer, drawn by the small predatory motion of her smile. At that instant, the wind died. Even the lanterns hesitated, flickering, as if they too sensed the weight of what was to occur. They always watch," she whispered to no one, her voice soft as moss growing over tombstones. The man shivered, tightening his hands around the collar of his coat. No one dared speak. The forest beyond the churchyard loomed black and impenetrable, branches scraping the sky like claws. Lantern light revealed the girl stepping closer, small feet sinking slightly into the damp soil. She knelt by the edge of the grave, fingers tracing invisible lines in the earth. The mourners inhaled sharply, hearts stilled by the tension. The hair as heavy as stone. "Child, what do you do?" murmured an old woman from the edge of the gathering, voice trembling with dread. "I name them," she said softly. Her head tilted toward the man, eyes gleaming in the lantern light. "And then they remember." The man's skin crawled as if the words themselves were alive. He tried to step back, but the earth beneath him seemed to cling, roots shifting, as though they had grown overnight. He could feel the small weight of her gaze pressing into his chest, sinking past ribs, probing the marrow. A whisper rose from the ground beneath the coffin, faint at first, like the rustling of dry leaves, and then louder, a chorus of the long-buried acknowledging her presence. The girl hummed a low note, and the vibration traveled through the soil, threading into the roots of nearby trees. From beneath the freshly turned earth, something moved. A hand, pale and trembling, emerged slowly, curling toward the man as if recognizing him by some ancient memory. He gasped, eyes wide, but could not look away. Her smile never faltered. It deepened, exquisite and cruel, as she bent closer to the grave. "They know your name," she whispered, almost reverently. "And now I will tell them." The mourners' breaths caught in unison as the wind shifted again, carrying the faint metallic scent of iron. The trees groaned and swayed without wind, branches tapping like fingers on the lanterns. Shadows pooled unnaturally near the girl, stretching along the graves, pooling beneath the coffin. The man's eyes darted to the pulsing shapes, pale forms sliding just beneath the surface of the soil, waiting, obeying, hungering. The girl's small hands hovered over the freshly turned earth, then pressed into the soil. Her humming rose to a soft chant, syllables forming a cadence that seemed older than memory. The hand beneath the ground twitched, rising higher, seeking her touch, and then, as she whispered the man's name, the air itself trembled, the soil quivered like a pulse, and the hand jerked upward violently, clutching at the cold night air. "Do you hear them?" she asked, voice lilting, almost joyous. "They remember. They follow." A cracking sound split the air, and the man stumbled backward, terror rooting him to the spot. The lanterns flickered violently as a shadow detached itself from the nearest oak, a shape indistinct yet unmistakably human rising from the earth. Its eyes glimmered faintly in the lantern light, a hollow recognition of the name she had spoken. A chorus of whispers followed, rolling over the congregation, naming the fearful, the curious, the guilty, the innocent. An ancient litany made, new by her voice. Old Miriam cried out, clutching her shawl over her ears. "Stop, stop, child, you cannot—" But the girl ignored her. She rose, small and perfect, the glow of lantern light pooling around her like molten silver. Her eyes locked on the man, who could only stare as the first grave opened fully, revealing the earth beneath curling back like skin. Pale hands, many and thin, grasped toward him, eager, unrelenting. "They are mine now," she whispered, voice a shiver through the marrow of the living. "And you will be remembered." The ground split further, releasing a whisper of breath that smelled of damp pine and decay. The man fell backward, lanterns scattering sparks across the wet grass. The congregation shrieked, but their voices were caught in the night, drowned by the soft, relentless chanting of the girl. By dawn, the first rays of light fell on the scene. The fresh cedar above the grave bore a name carved deep into its surface, sharp and deliberate, as if written by the earth itself, the very man who had dared meet her gaze. And though the villagers whispered and trembled, none dared approach. Beneath the soil, the pale hands rested, waiting for the next call, the next name, the next smile. And in the distance, just beyond the edge of the churchyard, the forest seemed to pulse in time with her heartbeat, whispering secrets older than the town itself, carrying the promise of more to come. The first core split the night before the dawn had even dared to rise, sharp and metallic, slicing through the mist that clung to the fields like wet wool. Black wings stirred in the darkness, gathering, rustling against one another in a sound that resembled dry bones scraping stone. They came before every death she foretold, an unbroken line of watchers that filled the horizon, their eyes glimmering faintly, as if holding secret knowledge of the grave. The girl stood at her window, small fingers curling around the sill, her gaze steady, unflinching. Her lips curved in that familiar smile, a slow, deliberate crescent that invited and warned all at once. The crows settled one by one upon the wooden frame, their talons tapping faintly against the boards. Even the bravest hunter, the one who had felled wolves and bears alike, would not cross her shadow when the black wings congregated. "They know," whispered old Miriam, voice tight as a bowstring. She crouched behind the low fence, shawl drawn tight around her head, eyes darting to the girl and then to the flock that had taken the field. "They know what is to come, and they wait." The girl tilted her head slightly, listening, though the sound of the wings was not for her ears alone. It was a language older than trees, older than stone, carried in the beat of feathers and the restless shifting of crows. Each beat thrummed through the soil, through the floorboards, into the marrow of those who dared watch. Her humming, soft and melodic, threaded through the rhythm, weaving command into the creature's flight. A sudden gust of wind scattered the mist across the fields, and for a moment the black forms wavered, rising and circling as if summoned from the earth itself. The air was heavy with the scent of rain-soaked soil and iron, of smoke and the sharp tang of coming death. Lanterns flickered in distant cottages, though no hand had moved them. The crow's eyes reflected the light with a brilliance that made the villagers recoil, their hearts hammering against their ribs in helpless terror. "She sees them," a man whispered, pressing his hands against the rough bark of a tree, knuckles white. "And they obey her." From the edge of the forest, shadows moved, slender, low, indistinct figures that had waited silently for the girl's attention. As she hummed, the shadows crept forward, merging with the rhythm of the wings. The sound of beating feathers and whispered rustling of leaves became a chorus, a dirge for the living and a summons for the dead. The girl's small hand rose slightly, as if conducting, and the flock shifted in perfect, terrible obedience, wings slicing the air with precision. The wind carried her voice outward, a soft, lilting hum that reached the nearest farmhouse. Windows rattled, doors shook on their hinges, and inside men and women froze mid-motion, caught in the invisible pull of her presence. Even the dogs howled, then fell silent, ears pricked and bodies trembling. Outside, the crows wheeled in tighter, formation, a living shadow circling the girl's home, and beneath their black wings the ground seemed to hum, vibrating with a latent energy that made the soil quiver. "They are waiting for the next," murmured Miriam, voice trembling, shawl, damp with dew. "For the next life she names, for the next soul she summons." A lone figure emerged from the trees, a hunter, lantern swinging loosely in his hand. He had faced wolves, bears, and storms, yet the sight of the girl at the window, flanked by wings black as midnight, stopped him in his tracks. Even from afar, the pull was irresistible. His boots sank slightly into the wet earth, each step dragging him forward though his mind screamed to retreat. The girl's eyes met his, and a shiver ran through him, deep and primal. "They listen," she whispered softly, "not to him, but to the world. They remember the names I call, and they follow." The hunter's lantern wavered, casting erratic light across the trembling wings. A few crows tilted their heads, their eyes glinting unnaturally, reflecting not the lantern, but the hunter's deepest fears. The shadows at the edge of the field stretched, bending unnaturally, reaching outward as if drawn to her small, deliberate presence. Even the trees seemed to lean closer, branches curling like fingers toward her, carrying the whispers of wind and wings. Suddenly the crows erupted in unison, a violent flurry of wings and black shapes. The sound was deafening, a rolling thunder. That rattled the bones of all who watched. The hunter fell to his knees, clutching his ears, eyes wide with the terror of knowledge he could not unlearn. In the midst of the swirling wings, the girl remained perfectly still, serene, her smile widening ever so slightly, as though she had orchestrated a symphony no mortal could hear fully. "They obey," she said, voice carrying effortlessly over the storm of feathers. "They obey what I name, and the world remembers." Miriam gasped, stumbling backward, shawl snagging on a fence post. "Stop, child, stop them!" "You cannot." The girl's head tilted, hair falling like a dark veil. "They will not stop," she said softly. "They are mine. They wait for my command, for the next name I speak, for the next life they shall shadow." A sudden cawing rose from the fields, louder, harsher, and the black wings arched high, circling the sky in perfect, deliberate formation. Below, the ground trembled faintly, as if some unseen hand pushed upward from beneath. One crow landed heavily on the sill, talons digging into the wood with a faint crack. Its eyes gleamed unnaturally bright, reflecting a light that was not from the lantern, not from the stars, but from somewhere else entirely, beneath, beyond, and older than the forest itself. The girl's lips parted, humming a single note that stretched across the night, winding through the wings and shadows alike. The hunter froze, body stiff, eyes wide with horror as he realized the wings were not merely watching. They were waiting for her next word, for her next smile, for her next summons. And then, with a movement slower than thought, the crow on the sill tilted its head and opened its beak, not to caw, but to speak, faint and rasping, the echo of a name that belonged to someone still living, someone who would not survive the night. The girl's smile lingered, small and terrible, and the forest, the fields, and the crows themselves seemed to pause in reverent anticipation. From the darkness beyond the window, a shadow shifted, taller than the girl, stretching and thin, its form bending unnaturally toward her, as if drawn by the rhythm of wings and the weight of her gaze. And in that suspended moment, the first name hung in the air, a name that would echo across the graveyard before the sun had risen. The swamp breathed with a wet, suffocating patience, and the air hung thick with decay and whispers that no living tongue could interpret. The wooden cross, warped and blackened by years of rot and storm, rose from the mud like a sentinel of some forgotten judgment. Beneath it the girl knelt, small and still, fingers tracing the mossed carvings as though reading an incantation no one else could hear. She sang, though no melody of this world carried the notes, The sound was hollow, resonant, a cry both human and impossible, echoing through the tangled roots and stagnant waters. Those who dared come near swore the reeds trembled and the frogs fell silent in obedience. The song wove through the swamp like smoke, curling around tree trunks, dripping through hanging moss, and sinking into the murky water until the surface shivered with nameless recognition. Her voice was soft, yet unyielding, deliberate, tugging, had the marrow of anyone foolish enough to listen. Some swore they could hear their own names slipping from her lips, though no one had spoken them aloud. "They call you," whispered a voice from the edge of the swamp, trembling like a reed in wind. It was old Miriam, kneeling on sodden ground, shawl heavy with mist. "Do you hear them calling through her?" The girl tilted her head, hair falling like black water across her shoulder. "They know me," she said softly, each syllable hanging in the humid air, vibrating the stagnant water beneath her knees. "And I remember them." The swamp seemed to lean closer, each twisted root and gnarled branch shifting imperceptibly as though listening. Water pooled around her, dark and oily, reflecting not the grey dawn, but the faint, impossible light of the hymn she sang. From the mire something stirred, thin, skeletal hands, fingers curled and twitching, reaching toward the girl in reverent anticipation. The reeds quivered, a chorus to the slow, deliberate cadence of her voice. "They are coming," Miriam whispered, clutching a wooden stake like a lifeline. Her voice was brittle, torn between awe and terror. "They follow the sound and they remember their names." The girl's humming rose to a soft chant, and the water rippled unnaturally, carrying her song across the swamp, past the trees, and into the distant fields where villagers slept or prayed, unaware that their own names were being summoned from shadow and mud. Shapes moved beneath the water, pale and indistinct, eyes glimmering faintly with recognition. They obeyed the call, rising slowly, deliberately, drawn by the weight of the girl's small, perfect presence. A lone crow perched on a branch above the cross, wings ruffling in rhythm with her song. Its eyes glimmered, reflecting not the morning, light but something older, a knowledge older than the swamp itself. The girl's head tilted toward the bird, and for a heartbeat the two regarded one another, predator and prophet entwined in a pact that none living could comprehend. "They are yours," Miriam gasped. "All that live and all that sleep. They answer you." The girl's smile deepened, a crescent of shadow and light, small and terrible. She rose, water lapping at her dress, voice carrying through the marsh like wind through tombstones. One skeletal hand broke the surface fully, then another, and soon several, reaching upward, seeking the warmth and command of her presence. The reeds bent, whispering their own names into her song, feeding the chant with echoes of forgotten things. Sudden gust rattled the hanging moss, and the crow took flight, wings beating a thunderous tattoo above the girl's head. Beneath, the water rippled violently, mud and debris spinning upward as if the swamp itself was alive, breathing, obeying the call of the small voice that led them. The dead rose a fraction higher, skeletal fingers clawing at the air, the wet earth slick beneath their grasp. "She speaks your name," Miriam sobbed, voice breaking under the weight of her terror. She knows every name." The girl hummed again, low and deliberate, and the swamp answered. A chorus of whispering voices rose from the muck, tangled reeds and rotting roots. Each voice bore a name, names of the living, the near-dead, the forgotten and the soon-to-be claimed. The hands reached higher, claws splashing water, eyes glimmering in the half-light, and the girl's small frame rose from the mud, perfect and unyielding, a center to the growing web of obedience and dread. A distant light flickered across the swamp, a lantern carried by one too curious, one too foolish to heed the warnings of the night. It bobbed across the dark waters, and the shadows recoiled slightly, like smoke drawn backward by the wind. The girl's gaze fell upon it, and the water's surface rippled unnaturally in response, skeletal fingers breaking through to touch the reflection of the living trespasser. "They hear you," she whispered softly, voice rising to a song that seemed to squeeze the air from lungs. "And I remember your name." The lantern trembled, casting fractured light across the blackened waters. The figure holding it froze, body stiff as the reeds pressed in, silent fingers of shadow reaching, from mud and water alike. The girl's eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the spectral forms beneath the surface, and her smile widened just enough for the darkness to feel it as a living thing. The swamp shuddered, water lapping higher against the wooden cross, reeds bending. In reverence, crows calling from unseen perches. The chanting of voices rose, overlapping and echoing in impossible harmonics. One by one, the skeletal hands dragged themselves closer, closer to the girl's feet, obeying every note of her song, every subtle command, every curve of her smile. And then, as the first light of dawn struggled through the mist, a single figure emerged from the murky water, eyes wide and unblinking, lips moving silently, mouthing a name that belonged to someone who had thought themselves safe in their bed. The girl's smile lingered, small, perfect, terrible. The hollow psalm continued, echoing across the swamp, carrying the names of the living and the dead, binding them all to her song. And far beneath the surface, unseen, the water shivered with the weight of more hands rising, waiting, obeying, remembering. The wind tore through the hollow streets of Pine Hollow with the ferocity of something alive, rattling shutters and tossing the brittle leaves into the muddy gutters. Rain fell in thick, cold sheets, pounding against the roof of the small house, at the edge of the forest. On the porch, a single lantern burned, steady, unwavering, impossibly bright against the night. Some whispered that it was not flame at all, but the glow of the soul she had taken into her keeping, trapped, obedient, and forever bound to her small, deliberate smile. No storm could extinguish it. No hands, however brave, could snuff its light. Even the Sabbath, when candles were lit in the church to honor God's mercy, faltered against its brilliance. It cast long, quivering shadows across the porch, stretching into the rain-soaked earth as though reaching for the wandering dead. The girl stood behind the lantern, small and still, fingers brushing its rim, her eyes reflecting the pale light in a way that made the shadows seem alive. She keeps them, old Miriam whispered from the edge of the yard, shawl clinging to her soaked shoulders. All the names, all the souls, she keeps them. The wind rattled the lantern violently, and for a heartbeat it seemed the glow might falter, but it did not. Instead, the light pulsed, deepening into a color not of this world, and the shadows beneath the porch shifted as though stirred by unseen hands. Shapes coalesced there, faint, trembling forms with hollow eyes and outstretched fingers, their mouths opening in silent murmurs. Each figure moved in slow, deliberate obedience to the small presence that watched from the doorway. Child. "What do you do?" Miriam called, voice trembling over the storm, her hands clenched together, knuckles white. "You cannot hold them all." The girl's lips curved in that same small, terrifying smile. "They are mine," she said softly. Her voice carried through the wind, through the rain, threading into the shadows, weaving her command into the trembling forms. And they remember. A crow landed on the porch railing, talons gripping the wood with a soft click. Its eyes glimmered, reflecting the lantern's impossible light. Another followed, then another, until the edges of the porch seemed rimmed. With black feathers, each bird perfectly still, perfectly aware, and perfectly obedient. The girl hummed a note, low and lilting, and the crows tilted their heads, wings twitching in response, sending shadows dancing across the soaked ground. "They watch," Miriam whispered, clutching a wooden stake as though it could save her. "Every step, every breath, they watch her, and they follow." The lantern's glow shifted, pulsing like a heartbeat, and the shadowy figures beneath the porch began to rise slowly, water and mud dripping from skeletal limbs. Their eyes were vacant yet knowing, hollow yet filled with the recognition of the girl who had called them, claimed them, kept them. They rose, obedient to her smallest gesture, moving in a silent procession across the porch. The wind whipped around them, tugging at clothes and hair, carrying their faint whispers through the storm, mingling with the pounding rain. From the forest, a shape emerged, indistinct and liminal, stepping carefully through the mud toward the house. A man, or what remained of one, drawn by curiosity, by disbelief, by a foolish sense of courage. The crows stirred, wings snapping and talons clicking in warning, yet the girl did not turn. She simply extended a hand, palm upward, and the procession of shadows paused mid-step, frozen in reverent obedience. "They remember you," she whispered softly, "and they obey, All of them. The man froze, feet sinking into the mud, lungs catching in terror. He dared not step closer, yet dared not turn away. From beneath the porch, a skeletal hand broke the surface fully, fingers twitching, reaching toward the light of the lantern. Another followed, then another, and soon the porch seemed alive with pale, trembling forms that had once been living and now were utterly hers. The girl's humming rose, threading through the storm, binding. The shadows and the crows and the very mist around the house. Each pulse of light from the lantern deepened the darkness around them, defining it, shaping it, giving it weight. The man's lantern, carried in a hand that shook violently, flickered and went out, leaving him blind, heart hammering, senses filled only with the glow of the lantern that would not dim. "They are waiting for your name," the girl said, smile widening, eyes alight with terrible knowledge. And then, "They will remember." A sudden clap of thunder shook the house, rattling shutters and splintering boards. The shadows beneath the porch surged upward, limbs twisting, clawing at the air as if tasting the living. The crows rose in a swirl of black feathers, wings beating in perfect synchrony with the pulses of the lantern. Rain sprayed in sheets, but it did not touch the glow. The storm seemed to bend around it, leaving a small, impossible halo of light in the darkness. The man stepped backward, slipping in the mud, and the skeletal hands reached outward, following the faintest sound of his movement. He fell hard against the wet earth, and the lantern on the porch pulsed brighter. A slow, deliberate heartbeat that seemed almost alive. The girl's humming continued, a hymn of ownership, of command, of terrible inevitability. "They will obey. The names I speak," she whispered. "And tonight, one more will join them." A shadow detached itself from the corner of the porch, taller than the girl, stretching unnaturally, bending as if not fully contained by the world. Ed's limbs were too long, too thin, reaching past the edge of the lantern's glow. The crows tilted their heads toward it, wings quivering. The shadows beneath the porch shifted, waiting, obedient, hungry. The girl's eyes met the impossible shadow, and her small hand rose slowly, palm outward. The lantern pulsed brighter, light spilling across the storm in waves, casting grotesque reflections across the wet ground. From the depths of the shadow, a whisper emerged, faint, impossible, a name that would soon be carved in cedar above, a fresh grave. And there on the porch the lantern burned steady and eternal, as if it were not flame at all, but the unblinking eyes of all the souls she had claimed, watching, waiting, and ready for the next name. The church smelled of damp wood and candle smoke, but beneath it lingered a scent older, fouler, something pressed into the stone and pews like a stain that could not be scrubbed away. The preacher's voice, once bold and full of fire, had dwindled to brittle mutters, words fraying at the edges like tattered cloth. His sermons no longer carried promise of heaven. Instead, they trembled in the pulpit, hesitant as if some invisible weight had silenced his faith. He avoided the pews where she had sat, the child whose small, deliberate smile had claimed more than hearts. It had claimed authority itself. Night after night he locked the chapel doors, checking each latch twice, thrice, as if a human lock could bar the will of the girl who had already moved through shadows and earth alike. Yet by morning she was always there, kneeling at the altar, hands folded, eyes closed, humming a tune that belonged to no one living. "They hear her," whispered old Miriam, voice trembling in the darkened corner of the nave. "Even God. Even he bends his ear to her song." The preacher's collar was damp with sweat, his knuckles white as he gripped the edges of the pulpit. His eyes darted toward the girl, who sat perfectly still beneath the stained glass light that fractured dawn into shards of crimson and violet. Her lips curved faintly, deliberately. She did not look at him, but he could feel her gaze, a weight, pressing into his chest, threading into bone, marrow, and thought alike. "Child, you should not," he muttered, throat dry, but the words trembled and fell like ash into the floorboards. The girl opened her eyes slowly, revealing depths too dark for any child, too knowing for any preacher. "I only answer," she said, softly, voice a whisper that travelled across the nave, threading through pews and altar railings, stirring dust motes like spirits waking from sleep. They call themselves I Only Answer. The preacher staggered backward, heart hammering, mind grasping at the edges of reason that frayed into panic. The air in the chapel thickened, turning heavy, almost viscous, as if breathed not by God, but by the things that moved unseen beneath floorboards and pews. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the walls, curling in slow arcs toward her, drawn by her presence, obeying the soft cadence of her humming. "She knows every name, Miriam," whispered from the corner, shawl clutched tight to her chest. "Every soul that stirs, every thought of the living, she knows them all." From beneath the altar a faint movement stirred, a skeletal hand, thin and pale, clawing through the dark between boards. It paused, reaching upward, and the preacher felt the chill crawl across his spine, as if the church itself had exhaled a breath of ice. The girl's humming rose, faint at first, then steady, threading through the timbers, echoing in the rafters. The hand moved faster now, grasping, curling toward her small feet. The preacher fell to his knees, pressing hands to his face. "Stop! Giant, stop it!" His voice was cracked, trembling, unheard by the congregation he no longer led. The walls groaned above him, long, low, almost vocal in their lamentation. The stained glass rattled in its frames. Sunlight fractured into jagged beams that shone on her upturned face, illuminating eyes that held no innocence, only the patient, terrible inevitability of power beyond comprehension. "She is no child," he whispered to the empty nave. She is the reckoning." The air shimmered with movement beneath the floorboards, shadows writhing as though the earth itself had grown restless. From the dark corners near the altar, forms began to rise, pale, slender, each one reaching toward her in silent obeisance. Their eyes glimmered faintly, hollow but aware, and with each inch they ascended, the chapel seemed to lean in closer, the stone pulsing faintly like a heartbeat. "Father." The girl's voice was soft, almost tender, but the word twisted the air, wrapping it around the preacher's throat. "You cannot speak now, you cannot stop me, you only watch." His lips moved, prayers falling out like spilled sand. The words found no ears, no mercy. The shadows beneath the altar stretched higher, skeletal fingers brushing against the hem of her dress. She rose, small and deliberate, humming a note that vibrated in the stones and rafters alike. The preacher's knees buckled beneath the weight of impossibility. "They obey every whisper I give," she said, voice a thread through the thickening air. "Every name, every call, and all that is bound is mine." The stained glass above shivered, light fracturing as if in protest, and the shadows on the floor coalesced, forming a thin, undulating mist that crept across the boards. The preacher's eyes darted to the pulpit, to the dark corners, to the high beams, yet nothing moved without her knowledge, without her will. He could feel the pulse of her command in the floorboards beneath him, in the altar steps, in the walls themselves. Miriam stumbled forward, breath ragged, eyes wide. "Lock the doors, seal the church." "It is too late," he gasped. "She is already inside." A sudden creak split the air. The pulpit board flexed, rising slightly as if pressed from beneath. Pale fingers reached through the seams, clawing at the polished wood, seeking, tasting the air, hungry. The girl's smile widened, small and perfect, cruel and inevitable. Her voice rose in a note that seemed to bend the very rafters, threading the shadows together in obedient unity. The preacher's face went pale as the forms beneath the floor emerged fully, skeletal and wet, eyes hollow, mouths moving silently as if chanting names only the girl could hear. The mist thickened, curling around her ankles, ascending to her knees, yet she remained unyielding, unafraid, the calm center of the rising storm. "They follow me," she whispered, almost gently, "and you will only witness." He tried to speak again, to call for help, to pray, but no sound came, swallowed by the weight of her presence. The walls of the chapel seemed to lean inward, and the beams groaned as if acknowledging a new, terrible authority. The shadows twisted, rising higher, skeletal fingers brushing the altar steps, curling around the edge of the pulpit, creeping toward the preacher as if tasting his fear. And in that suspended moment, as sunlight fractured through the stained glass illuminating dust and shadow alike, The girl's eyes met his, unblinking, and he realized the truth he had long denied. She had always been inside. Even before the dawn, the chapel doors rattled once, twice, and then slowly, impossibly, opened on their own. The girl's small figure stood framed in the threshold, shadows pooling at her feet, mist curling from the floorboards like smoke. And beneath the pulpit, the skeletal hands twitched in anticipation, waiting for the next name he could not yet speak. The earth trembled beneath countless feet, though the graves were too numerous to tally. Night hung thick and suffocating over Pine Hollow, a black velvet sky pierced only by the feeble glow of torches, flickering in the fog that rolled through. The cemetery like living smoke. In their wavering light, her small figure moved among the headstones, pale dress brushing the wet grass, face lifted to the heavens with that impossible, deliberate smile. It gleamed brighter than any torch, brighter than the waning moon, cutting through shadow as if it alone could command the darkness. No one dared approach. They had learned too well. The smile was not joy, but a promise, one that carried weight, inevitability, and the memory of every name she had spoken, every soul she had claimed. The villagers huddled behind fences and broken walls, faces pale, breaths caught in their throats, hearts hammering with a terror that had grown patient and constant over months. From the shadows, skeletal fingers twitched and reached upward, shoving soil aside, breaking the silence of the graveyard with the faint scrape of bone on earth. "She is everywhere," whispered old Miriam, voice ragged with years of fear and awe. "Every shadow, every stone. It answers her call. And we are nothing." The girl knelt beside a fresh mound of earth, small hands pressing against the soft soil. Her humming rose into a chant, a low, deliberate cadence that pulsed with authority over life and death alike. The dead stirred beneath her fingertips, skeletal hands rising slowly, then stopping as if waiting for permission. Even the crows gathered on gravestones and fence posts leaned closer, wings half open, beaks twitching with expectation. "They obey me," she whispered softly, voice threading through the fog. "Every name, every soul, mine to remember." The congregation of villagers could hear the chant ripple through the ground. From beneath the earth, a single coffin shifted. Nails groaned and splintered, wood cracking as if breathing. Pale hands erupted from the top, grasping at the air, shaking violently. The girl's smile widened, and a faint light seemed to rise from her eyes, illuminating the skeletal forms that obediently followed her rhythm. One by one they emerged, rising in silent procession, pale and trembling, but completely under her sway. A man stumbled forward from the edge of the graveyard, lanterns swinging in erratic arcs, dripping water from the mud. His breath caught, chest heaving with terror as he saw the girl, small and still at the center of the growing tide of the dead. The torchlight flickered across her face, reflecting something unhuman in her eyes, an awareness that transcended childhood, a command that bent the living and dead alike. "Stop her!" someone shouted from the edge of the crowd, voice cracking under the weight of fear. "You cannot—" "She is beyond you," whispered Miriam, gripping a wooden stake like a lifeline. "Beyond all of us. She only answers what is already hers." The dead moved closer, skeletal forms slipping over graves, toes skimming wet earth, fingers brushing the shoulders of the living with a chill that sank into bones. The crows lifted, wings beating in a rhythm that matched her chant, filling the night with a sound like the wind through hollow tombstones. The villagers stumbled backward, cries caught in their throats, hearts hammering against their ribs, but they could not look away. Every shadow seemed drawn toward her, pulled into the orbit of her presence, twisting unnaturally as if acknowledging her authority. The girl rose fully, small frame perfect, poised, her voice lifted, a single note that reverberated through the graveyard, through every stone, every root, every skeletal hand. The earth itself pulsed in response, quivering beneath the procession of the dead, shaking the ground beneath the villagers' feet. Lanterns bobbed, torches sputtered, but her light, the radiance of her smile, remained constant, unyielding, absolute. "They follow what I name," she said, voice both soft and infinite. "And now, I name the last." A hush fell over Pine, hollow, the fog thickening like a tide ready to swallow the living whole. The skeletal hands paused mid-step, trembling as though savoring the final command. The villagers held their breath, frozen, unable to move, unable to flee. The girl's small hand lifted slowly, pointing toward the farthest edge of the graveyard. Where the soil had shifted unnaturally, mounds pressed tight together, countless shapes waiting beneath. A flash of light, unnatural and bright, emanated from her eyes, and the ground shook violently. The dead rose as one, a wave of pale, trembling figures surging toward the appointed name. The man at the edge of the graveyard fell to his knees, lantern rolling into mud, eyes wide as realization dawned. The final name was his own. "Remember," she whispered softly, each syllable a knife through the air, "and be mine." The skeletal hands burst from the ground in a frenzy, pale and grasping, teeth chattering in the silence of the night. The fog thickened, obscuring the forms, the torches, the trembling villagers. Only her smile remained visible, small and perfect, gleaming brighter than any flame, casting shadows that stretched unnaturally across the hills of graves, wrapping around the living, the dead, and the earth itself. And then, as the fog swallowed everything, the villagers could hear it. The soft, deliberate hum, the rising chant, the whisper of countless names being claimed in unison. The light of her smile cut through the darkness like a promise written in bone and earth, and all who saw it knew the truth they had long denied. There was no mercy in her gaze, no warmth in her grin, only the inevitability of what was to come. From the farthest edge of the cemetery, the earth heaved, and a single hand, thin and pale, emerged first. Then another, and another, until a tide of the dead pressed toward her, awaiting the final command. The girl's lips curved just slightly, as if savoring the moment, and in that instant, Pine Hollow realized that her smile was the last thing they would ever see, the final mark of a world now entirely hers. And as the fog closed over the cemetery, the torches guttered, the lanterns dimmed, and the villagers' screams were swallowed by the night. Her smile lingered, gleaming brighter than the funeral torches, a promise older than the town, older than death itself.